Hi, I'm Miss Bovey,
And I'm Miss Hardy.
and this is our second podcast on the Industrial Revolution. And today we're going to be focusing specifically on sort of the effects and sort of reactions to the Industrial Revolution.
This is probably the most important podcast for understanding why the Industrial Revolution was a turning point in world history. So really that's the lens in which we're going to talk to you all today, is how important the Industrial Revolution was for changing society in the world.
So it's really important to understand that virtually every aspect of society transformed as a result of the Industrial Revolution. Not only because people are moving from rural to urban areas, but everything, family life structure and all of that stuff. So let's first look at the effects on families. As we briefly talked about last time, family members prior to the Industrial Revolution spent a lot of time working together, typically on their family farms, and really enjoyed the aspect of really spending quality time with each other. But with the introduction of industrial work and factory work, people have to separate from their families and actually go to a factory to do their work. And so they're spending far less time with each other. And work within the factory is terrible, as we mentioned before. 16 hours a day, 6 days a week, exhaustion, heavy machinery, just the effects of the machines themselves with like the filaments in the air, which will clog your lungs. If you're working in the coal mines, then it's the coal dust. All of these things really make life terrible, not only for individuals, but for families as a whole. And of course, the low wages of factory workers will force parents to send their children to work in factories as well, because they just can't afford to continue living. So children as young as 5 years old will begin working in mills because, once again, their small size, nimble fingers allows them to crawl into those machines to do that work. So really, it just radically changes the family structure.
And with so many families now working in these new industrial factories, we see a mass urbanization occur in these large cities. And so really what we're going to see in the first half of the 19th century, urban areas are growing rapidly with really little planning by the government. So we have a really bad, damaging ecological effect. The working families work in really shoddy factories. They live in shoddy apartments called tenements. And so with that, these low-income families are really in a deplorable living situation. Sewers and sewage are on the streets, and it becomes this breeding ground for a lot of diseases like cholera, dysentery, and tuberculosis.
All right, so now let's transition to what sort of effect this has on class systems. Well, really, the people that begin to work and labor in factories and mines are known as the working class, and they really are the lowest rung of industrial society. And because with the introduction of interchangeable parts, people can't even rely on the expertise of a craft anymore to distinguish themselves, because they're completely replaceable, at least in the eyes of the managers, and thus they are able to be only paid really low wages as a result of that. But even though we have a rise of these low-skilled jobs that are factory jobs, we also have the rise of this new burgeoning middle class consisting of factory and office managers and some business owners, and these are known as white-collar jobs. Most of the time, these white-collar jobs were, almost always, they were literate, considered to be part of that middle class, and had access to a lot more money and a lot more opportunity for themselves and their families. And of course, at the top of this hierarchy are really the newly wealthy industrialists. Now, mind you, the nobility still exists to some degree, especially in Britain. But this is now an elevated class of new rich, as they call it, the nouveau riche. Because they're the owners of these large corporations, and so they get the title of captains of industry, and will start to overshadow the landed aristocracy because they have all of this money and power that they can really make and start to change the way things run even within the government.
Right. And so when we look at the landed elite, these nobility, they don't have a whole lot of change occurring because of the Industrial Revolution. The only effect they'll have is this new rival upper class that comes about thanks to these new factories. So women have this interesting growth during this time period. So for the new middle class women, we have this idea that they must be a part, it's this idea of cult of domesticity. So we talked about last time how if a male could get away with not working, it was a status symbol to have the wife live at home. And so with that, we have this idea of the cult of domesticity, and it's this idealized version of a female homemaker. So advertising encouraged women to buy household products, and it would supposedly make the home the husband's place of kind of refuge, their place of respite from the workday. So pamphlets even instructed these middle-class women how to care for their home, how to raise their children, how to behave in polite society. And it really urged them to be very pious, submissive, pure, and domestic. But for the working class women, this was doubly hard because, as we talked about, they're having to work full-time jobs for half the pay of men. In fact, a lot of factory owners will turn towards hiring women because they could get away with paying them half the rate of men. And so these women who are working full-time jobs are still expected to have this cult of domesticity at home. So it becomes a double burden, which is why we see this further rise of feminism, which was an effect of the political revolutions, but it'll be further promoted during this time because women are going, look, we need fair wages for fair work, and we really need to come to a place where we can manage our roles as females in the society.
And as a whole, these new middle-class women don't support this trend of feminism. It will more likely fall on the burden of the working class because they're the ones that feel the overwhelming burden of what it takes to sort of be a woman in this new industrial society. All right, now let's turn to the effect of mass culture. So because of the rise of industrialization, we see a culture of consumerism and as well as a culture of leisure that develop among the working and the middle class. Consumption, as you know, needed to be kept up with production, so we see the growth of advertising, particularly to the middle class, because the middle class has the extra income to be spent on non-essential goods. And leisure activities such as biking and boating become really popular during the late 1800s, and companies start to encourage their workers to participate in athletics because they believe that sports rewarded virtues such as self-discipline and playing by the rules. And so as you can imagine, the sale of athletic equipment also generated lots of business for those people that made everything from soccer balls to sports stadiums. We'll also see by the end of the 1800s, that the Olympic Games will actually come back because now we see that the culture is ready for these sort of like sporting and competition events. Now, one of the other effects of this is because the people that work in a factory, it is such an awful life and so bleak. Spending time on material goods and leisure activities really become their escape, and that's why we're going to see a rise in these things. And with the invention of radio and then eventually film, you're going to see a growth in these industries as well.
So I know we've talked to you about so many pleasant effects of the Industrial Revolution, so I'm going to talk once more about the effect on the environment. So the industrialization was really powered by energy, specifically using fossil fuels like coal, petroleum, and natural gas. So even though burning coal produced more energy than burning wood, the effects on the environment were way worse. And so in doing that, water's becoming polluted, the air is now toxic thanks to the coal burning factories. A lot of these new industries are dumping their waste into streams, rivers, and lakes. And so because of this, we see this over-polluted environments, especially in the cities, that they're going to have to deal with later.
So with all of this stuff going on, there are some people that really make out like bandits. And that really is sort of the development and the emergence of capitalism as an economic system and really this new sort of business organization. And one of them is manufacturers begin to form giant corporations in order to sort of minimize their risk. And a corporation is essentially a business chartered by a government as a legal entity that is owned by stockholders. You'll see this sort of model during the mercantilist period where the stockholders could buy shares in the trading companies, but this really gets like expanded during this time period as we go away from trading companies and we get these large corporations.
So what happens then if a corporation is at fault for something and someone sues the corporation? Do the stockholders share the blame?
No, typically if they were to be sued, the stockholders are not liable for what takes place. Most of the time you're going to see this if the company actually goes bankrupt, the stockholders are not liable for the losses. They really just lose what money they paid into the company in the first place. But on the flip side, If the company does really well, then however much money that they invested in that company, they can earn a massive amount of money as well. Some corporations will become so effective at sort of like maximizing their profit that they will form what is known as a monopoly, meaning that they will control all aspects of a specific business and will eliminate all of their competition. For example, Alfred Krupp of Essen, Germany, ran a gigantic company that used the Bessemer process, which was a more efficient way to produce steel, gaining a monopoly in the German steel industry. In the United States, you're going to see the rise of the robber barons like Rockefeller and Carnegie, who will control both the oil and the steel industries here in the United States.
And so now we're going to look at really the responses. So we have all of these effects. So what's going to happen then to kind of address these negative effects? And so the first one we're really going to see is the growth of unions. So a lot of dangerous and unsanitary working conditions, the idea of low wages, the 16 more hours that people are working, kind of spurred workers to form these labor unions. So these are just organizations of workers that advocate for the right to bargain over these matters with their employers, and to kind of work with the government or the company to kind of form a contract.
So, Ms. Hardy, are you telling me that companies and employers were okay with their workers organizing against them?
Not at first. So when labor unions first started to rise, a lot of times people would have to meet in secret for fear of factory owners and managers firing them on the spot. Plus, the government at this time did not view labor unions as like working for the people. Instead, they viewed them as enemies of trade. And so it won't be until a little bit later in the early 20th century that unions become more acceptable and membership increased. So because of this, unions improved workers' lives. They won them minimum wage laws. They put limits on the number of hours they had to work. They gave them overtime pay. And we had the establishment of the 5-day work week. We see this especially in England and Great Britain, with a lot of reform bills that Parliament passes in 1832, 1867, 1884. And this will expand the number of men who could vote and give more representation to British cities. And the act reduced the property ownership requirements for voting. So it laid the foundation for the expansion of the idea of franchisement, which is the ability to vote, which will eventually occur in 1918, even though British women don't gain that until 1928, surprisingly, after America.
I know. Actually, the first voting rights in the world for women will happen in Australia and New Zealand in the late 1800s, but of course in the United States won't happen until after World War I. Really, President Roosevelt sees this as a reward for the women. We're helping so much, and they had been fighting so long at that point that
So
might as well.
The poor females deserve their right to vote in 1920.
Yes.
Thank you, 19th Amendment.
Along with unions, social activists and reformers hope to improve the living conditions of the least powerful in society, specifically children. A law in 1843 declared that children under the age of 10 were banned from working in the coal mines. And in 1881, education became mandatory for British children between the ages of 5 and 10. So this focus on education, as opposed to work for monetary gain, permanently redefined the role of children in urban societies. Of course, all industrialized nations grappled with the new challenges that factory life introduced. Among these nations, for example, Germany implemented the most comprehensive set of social reforms to protect industrial workers. Under the leadership of Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, Germany started workers' accident compensation insurance, unemployment insurance, and old age pensions for employees. Bismarck was only somewhat interested in the health and security concerns. He was far more concerned that if his government did not address these problems, socialists and other more radical citizens would demand stronger government action, which would eventually lead to social unrest.
So I think we can see here the long-lasting effect of these political revolutions, because if you start seeing your people are upset now, you want to address it before there's another political revolution. So when we talk about this new world that industrialization has created, we need to really look a little bit further back and understand that ever since the early modern era, we've seen this increased involvement of truly global trade. We see that with the rise of the silver trade, with a lot of flow silver moving from the Americas into China. And so now the industrialization brings that even further. So this increased interdependence among people around the world is one major result of the industrialization process. So British factories will import minerals from around the world to make its products. They'll purchase cotton from the US, Egypt, and India to make textiles that they sold throughout Europe and other parts of the world. And similarly, the responses of industrialization built greater connections among people. So labor leaders will advocate the formation of international unions so that workers in various countries could unite to demand higher wages. So reforms that began in one country often spread to others. For example, Bismarck's social reforms will spread throughout Europe and eventually will influence much of the world.
So really, we see that the world is radically shrinking during this time period and will only continue to do so. So with all this rise of capitalism and industrialization, this really began to get people to think about society in new ways. Now, we already talked about Adam Smith in our Scientific Revolution Enlightenment podcast, but we want to revisit him here. So Adam Smith published The Wealth of Nations in 1776 and really is considered the foundational text in support of capitalism and the establishment of private enterprise. In this work, Smith describes his theory of the invisible hand of the market. If businesses were allowed to operate in their own interests, society in general would benefit. And though Smith recognized the need for some government regulations, his ideas were a precursor to the laissez-faire philosophy popular in the late 19th century, which basically opposed nearly all government regulations that limited businesses.
So this is really going to be popular with our industrial captains of industry. Their sole idea is to make more and more profit, and so they're really going to espouse the ideals of Adam Smith. But we're also going to see a reaction to that because there's a lot of people that the Industrial Revolution was not good for, and we're going to see some reactions to capitalism form during this time period, one of which being John Stuart Mill. So he believed that laissez-faire or laissez-faire capitalism could be inhuman to workers, and so he would call for reform. And so John Stuart Mill, he's a champion of social reforms of the industrial age. This included labor unions, child labor laws, and laws that ensured safe working conditions. So he advocates a philosophy called utilitarianism. And so the idea is that you want the greatest good for the greatest number of people. Utilitarians didn't want to overthrow capitalism, though they weren't that far, but they did want to address some of those problems.
Now, on the flip side, unlike Mill, there were other reformers that argued that capitalism was fundamentally flawed. And though it created tremendous wealth, it also created tremendous suffering. And these reformers argued for socialism, a system in which major resources and industries would be owned by the workers or the government on behalf of all people. Some bought large tracts of land where they could establish new, ideal communities because they hoped to start society anew, and they were criticized as being utopians.
So in this utopian socialism, we're going to see the full extent of that brought by Mr. Karl Marx.
Ooh, he's a biggie.
This is like
put a big star next to your notes because he is essential for your understanding of this time period.
He is the most influential advocate of socialism. He's this German scholar and writer, and he was born up and really seeing the negative effects of industrialism. He was born in poverty, and so even though he kind of grew up to be this German scholar, he saw the negative effects of capitalism, or what he saw to be capitalism's fault in the industrial cities. And so he's a fierce critic of utopian socialists for their desire to escape the problems rather than address them. And he called his approach to economics scientific socialism. So in 1848, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, they published a pamphlet that's known as the Communist Manifesto. And so in this, it summarized basically their critique of capitalism. So according to Marx, capitalism divided society into two classes, the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. So the proletariat was essentially the working class. These are people who worked in factories and mines and really were paid very little. And so the other class, the bourgeoisie, it's the middle class, and it included these capitalists who owned the machinery and factories where the working class provided the goods. And so with that, he argued that in a capitalist system, the bourgeoisie exploit the proletariat endlessly for the sake of profit. And so because the bourgeoisie owned the means of production, so the machines, the factories, the mines, they received most of the profits. The proletariat, who did the physical and dangerous work, received very little wealth they produced. So Marx basically had this idea that workers had to take control of the means of production and share the wealth they created fairly. And so in the end, capitalism, according to Marx, would usher in this era of equality and justice. And so this Marxist socialism became known as communism. Now, he believed that this would come by workers overthrowing the government in this violent revolution. And so his evolved ideas come in later. So at first he has this idea of like, oh, people are going to share their wealth, it'll be equal. However, he strongly advocated for democracy, and sometimes it's all about the radical idea of the people. However, in others, he would speak favorably about this dictatorship of the proletariat. Not surprising, people who often call themselves Marxist interpret his writings really differently than we do. So some argued for a gradual, peaceful transition from capitalism to socialism, and others believed that a quick and violent upheaval would only work. So at one point, Marx becomes so frustrated with the ideas people associated with him that he declared that he's not even a Marxist.
Well, the other interesting thing is we're going to see how other countries interpret this idea and how that sort of shifts their government systems as well. So it's really difficult to overstate the importance of the Industrial Revolution.
It's really important.
Really important. If we haven't sort of showcased you all of the changes that were made prior, like during this time period, and shown you how it is a turning point, then rewind, listen to this again so that you get the effects of it. So, of course, let's recap some of the big ones, though. Mass production made goods cheaper, more abundant, and more easily accessible to a greater number of people than ever before. We see the growth of factories was a primary factor driving people to move, both from rural areas to cities and from agrarian countries to industrial ones. So not only are you going to see people moving inside their own country from farms to cities, but from other countries to more industrialized countries because there's going to be more work. Stay tuned. There'll be another podcast that deals with that particular topic as well. We're going to see both low-skilled workers and high-skilled professionals moved to take advantage of the new opportunities provided by industrialization. Now, however, the natural byproducts of industrial production polluted the air and water supplies. Industry forever changed the nature of work and the lives of workers. Working populations became concentrated in urban centers as opposed to being spread among rural areas, and the workplace shifted from homes to factories, dramatically altering family life. The Industrial Revolution created a new, and many said unequal, working relationship between workers and owners.
So what's the global effect? We see the rise of all these industrial nations in Europe and America and even Russia and Japan, but what's going to be the big takeaway moving into the next time period?
Well, really, nations that industrialized early found that they needed more materials to power their production. And so they're going to look beyond their borders for raw materials, such as cotton and rubber. Those will be the two primary things that are needed, at least initially during this time period. And so by exploiting overseas natural resources, they both destroyed early industrialization in Egypt, China, and India, and will usher in a second wave of colonization that will be far more devastating than the initial colonization during the early modern period.
So it's fair to say, or suffice to say, that though the Industrial Revolution did well for the middle class and for these captains of industry, the long-term effects of imperialism may or may not outweigh the benefits that the Industrial Revolution brought.
Well, one other change that also brought about with the Industrial Revolution, during this time period, dynamite also gets invented. And it was invented by a man by the name of Alfred Nobel. And Nobel, you might have heard the last name before because we have things like the Nobel Peace Prize and the Nobel Prize for Literature and Science and Medicine. And well, one of the things he discovers that he, of course, invents dynamite to help improve the ability to access mines and things like that to get these natural resources out of the ground. And of course, shortly after the invention, militaries see the the usefulness of using dynamite in war as well. And he's horrified that his invention could be used to take people's lives. And so basically he invested all of the money that the profits, and he made a massive amount of profits because of his invention, into creating and establishing this Nobel system where he would reward people for being captains of their own intellectual fields and fields of science and peace and all of those things, because that's what he wanted his legacy to be, and not death and destruction.
I would say that he did well in his goals, because now his name is synonymous. You can't say Nobel without Peace Prize being directly after it.
And really that's sort of like the highest achievement that anyone could get in any academic or leadership position in the world. All right, so we hope you enjoyed this podcast on the Industrial Revolution, especially the effects of the Industrial Revolution.
We hope to see you next time.
Bye.
Bye.